Clinical psychology programs get thousands of applications, and most of them make the exact same mistake. Lindsey Snaychuk knows this firsthand.
It took me several cycles to get in as I had to kind of develop that knowledge.
Now a PhD student studying compulsive sexual behavior, she shares what actually helps you stand out for clinical psych, how she handled rejection, and the lessons that every applicant should know.
I'm Dr. Lee.
And I'm Emilia.
Welcome to the Enriched Mindset Podcast.
Today we're thrilled to welcome someone who brings both clinical expertise and a passion for mentorship to the table. She's a clinical psychology PhD student at Toronto Metropolitan University and a dedicated therapist, researcher, and mentor who's making waves in the field of addiction and mental health. Please welcome Lindsey Snaychuk.
We're so excited to have you here, Lindsey. From mentoring future psychologists to advancing research in compulsive sexual behavior and addiction treatment, your work is truly inspiring. But before we dive into all of that, we've got a couple of psych-themed dad jokes for you.
Sure. Hit me.
I'll start us off, okay? So what do you call a potato that doesn't want to do therapy?
Oh my gosh. Tell me.
A hesitator.
A hesitator. That's cute. That's very cute.
All right, here's another one. Why wouldn't the bicycle ever stand up for itself?
I don't know.
Because it was too tired.
Oh, I like that one. That one's sweet.
All right, Lindsey. Well, we're really interested to know what initially sparked your interest in psychology, and if you could just tell us a bit about your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I've thought about this answer, and it might be a little bit cliche, but growing up, I was really interested in people. Very analytical, very inquisitive. I always had to know why things were the way they were. Come high school, psychology was an elective I took in high school. It was really the only subject that caught my attention and that I actually was interested in. And I just was all in from there. And then in university, I realized, oh my goodness, this psychology thing, it feels like I have to go to grad school maybe. Oh my gosh, what does that entail? And I learned a little bit more about the research component of psychology, which I think initially freaked me out a little bit, because I think when you start doing research as an undergrad, it's a lot of literature reviews and annotated bibliographies. And I'm oh my goodness, I don't know if I could do this for the rest of my life. And then I did my undergrad thesis. And that was really the moment that I knew I'm on the right path, because nothing is cooler to me than being able to formulate your own question and answer your question, essentially. Yeah, and basically the rest is history. Just been in it since then.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you're at right now with your journey? What do you study? What are your future plans?
Yeah, absolutely. I will be going into PhD 3 this year. So this will be my last year of classes and coursework. And then the final year will be my residency or internship. So I'll be applying for that this year in the clinical psych stream at TMU. I study in the Addictions and Mental Health Lab under Dr. Andrew Kim. We primarily study behavioral addictions, and my kind of area of expertise, you could say, is compulsive sexual behavior, otherwise commonly referred to as sex addiction.
As a first-generation student, what are some of the unique challenges and motivations that shaped your academic path?
Yeah, I think probably the best answer I can give is that as a first-gen student, you don't know what you don't know. And when I think back to all of the things that I didn't know, it's overwhelming to think about how many kind of mistakes I made, but I didn't know that I was making mistakes. I didn't have anyone to read any of my personal statements. I didn't have anyone to review any of my applications. I didn't understand all that what went on behind the scenes in terms of admissions for grad school, the politics and the funding and all of that. And so I was really naive. I thought it was just put together a good application. I had a thesis I was working on. I thought that was enough to get me where I needed to go. I didn't realize you needed all the research experience. I didn't know how helpful connections were. And so it took me several cycles to get in, as I had to develop that knowledge, because no one around me had gone to grad school. And for my undergrad, I went to an institution that didn't have any psych grad students. I didn't have anywhere to turn, and we were a teaching institution too, so it wasn't particularly research focused. My profs, it had been many years since they applied to grad school, so it was pretty isolating, honestly.
Yeah. Can you talk to us about how you decided to pursue study in sex addiction and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have always had an affinity towards topics that are a little bit more taboo and a little bit more uncomfortable to talk about. That's just because I've always felt more comfortable talking about these things. When I was in university, I had a human sexuality course, and I had the time of my life in that course. It was like really transformative for me, and I thought, I really want to be in some area of sexuality going forward. Around the same time, we had an instructor at my university who was also the executive director at a treatment center for addiction. I hit her up, I cold emailed her, and I just said, hey, is there any way to get involved? I would love some kind of like clinical exposure before grad school. And she said, yeah, absolutely. So I did a practicum as an undergrad at this treatment center. I said, really interested in the sexuality aspect. And she let me shadow a sex, love, and relationships group, basically. And that was the moment I realized I could merge this experience I had with addictions for my interest in sexual health. And that was it. I just took that to grad school with me.
That's amazing. Can you tell us what a sex addiction is?
So I guess it's probably important to say that sex addiction is not a clinically recognized term. Somebody would not be diagnosed with sex addiction. What they would be diagnosed with in the present, in 2025, is compulsive sexual behavior disorder. It's not in our DSM-5, which is what we typically use in psychology, but it is in the ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases. And there, it's actually classified as an impulse control disorder rather than a sexual addiction. But really what you're looking at there is you're looking at out of control impulsive sexual behavior that causes distress or impairment with our other kind of mental health conditions.
And how does that develop in a person? Are there multiple factors or some primary factors that influence that development?
I would say that they're probably pretty similar to other addictions.
Okay.
We know that there's a strong role of past childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and protective factors like recovery capital, social support, and these types of things. But I would say trauma is a pretty common correlate of the people that I see.
How would you say social media shapes now as you're seeing the sex addictions?
I would say that the media really sensationalizes it in a way. You see these headlines like politician, influencer, celebrity gets caught cheating on wife, blames sex addiction. And so I think as a whole, we have a misunderstanding about what sex addiction really is, because oftentimes we see it tied to infidelity scandals and things like that. But really it comes down to that distress and impairment associated with the sexual behavior. And so that's really distressing for the individual, irrespective of the relationships in their life as well.
Yeah. And how would someone distinguish between sex addiction and love addiction? Or there's overlap there?
There's a lot of overlap. Yeah. Love addiction is something that I know a little bit less about, but again, not really a clinically recognized term. And oftentimes what you do see in the addiction treatment world is you see them paired together. And I would say a lot of the risk factors are the same and a lot of the treatment is the same. We look a lot at attachment theory and those types of things.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of think about how things have changed in terms of dating apps and how people now have access to a huge pool of people. And even if they're in a relationship, if they're, let's say, they're still on these apps and they're getting a bunch of interest and likes, is that whole process feeding into people's addictions in some way?
Could be.
Yeah.
I am a very big believer that behavior is not necessarily inherently bad or good, of course, unless, you're harming somebody else, for example. But it's really about the function of that behavior. Right? So if somebody came in to see me, I'd be like, what's going on? Why are we doing this? Is there something that's feeding for that person? Yeah. And for a lot of times with compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction, a lot of it comes down to it being a coping mechanism, honestly, it is with a lot of other addictions, right? Where it becomes difficult is because it's not a substance addiction and sex is a normal, healthy part of human lives. It's where do we set that boundary between having those healthy sexual relationships without them being harmful?
Right.
What has been your most transformative moment of your graduate school journey so far?
Yeah, I would say it was probably I guess PhD 1 or maybe the end of MA 2. It was when I found out that I got CGS-D. And for those that don't know, CGS-D is a doctoral level scholarship. I believe the value is $120,000 or something across a couple of years. That was a really big deal for me because for the first couple years of grad school, the imposter syndrome, we all struggle with it to some extent, I think. Being a first-gen student, having so many failed application cycles, I spent my first year or two wondering, did I luck into this? Did I get here by accident? I actually, going into my cohort, I was one of the only students that didn't have external funding, and I felt like I had to fight a little bit harder. And so when I got CGS-D my first year, that was really the moment that I felt like, oh my goodness, like maybe my hard work actually paid off, and maybe I belong here, and maybe I need to have a little bit more confidence in myself.
Yeah. What's a day in the life like for you at TMU and at CAMH?
I spent my last 8 months at CAMH finishing off my practicum placement. I would be there 2 days a week, which is pretty typical in a PhD program for practicums. When I was at CAMH, I would typically see like a couple of therapy patients in the morning. I was specifically seeing them for cannabis use disorder. So I was delivering CBT with motivational enhancement protocol. And then I would do assessments as well, so psychodiagnostic assessments, which involved using the DART. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with the DART, but the DART basically like assesses like kind of the most common mental health disorders. And then also a timeline follow back, so we would look and see like what their substance use looked like over the past 60 days. And then I would write a few integrated reports here and there. And at TMU in the summer, fortunately, I don't have that much to do in the summer, but it's just a lot of catching up on research, tying off loose ends with my papers, and then I'm in classes in the fall, and I do a little bit of teaching now as well too.
What are you teaching?
I taught drugs and behavior this past semester, which was my first course, and I may be teaching clinical psychology upcoming in the fall, potentially.
Cool.
It's up in the air, but
Yeah. What are like some of the most common misconceptions that people have about like clinical training and the whole process?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Like the best way I can answer that is based off of my own misconceptions. Again, maybe this is just because I was like first gen and I didn't have a lot of knowledge, but I think I assumed that most programs were effectively the same. Right? You're always going to have like a range and quality and some nuance there. But I thought in terms of the training you got, it would all look the same, which is not true and it's not bad. But even if you just take the GTA, for example, different schools operate from different theoretical orientations. And so I come from a school that's like very heavily rooted in CBT. We got really fantastic CBT training. And then for our external practicum placements, we have the option to kind of seek out training in additional modalities. I think York, if I'm not mistaken, for example, is very like person-centered, doesn't use a lot of CBT. And again, none of that's bad. It's just interesting that if you're applying widely to programs, it's something to look at. What kinds of things are the students learning, and then what kind of opportunities do they have to supplement with in the future?
Right. And then you've had clinical placements at St. Mike's and Toronto Western. How did those experiences shape your clinical identity?
I feel really, really fortunate to have been at TMU because of our first practicum placement at St. Mike's. So I think it's at the very, like basically the end of the first year, we do our placement at St. Michael's Hospital as part of the family health team. We typically work with like low income, really complex care needs individuals. And I can tell you it's kind of like a shared experience that going into that at the end of your first year of grad school feels very overwhelming and very scary. But I am so grateful to have had that experience because it felt like something that made me quite competitive for external placements because we did see a wide range of presenting concerns, right? And then at Toronto Western, I worked in the bariatric surgery clinic, actually. It came highly recommended to me by some of my mentors and some of my colleagues, and it actually sparked a new interest in health psychology, and now I plan to specialize in health psychology, which I never thought that I would, but I enjoyed it that much. And really, I can't recommend enough for people to just, seize the opportunities that you have in front of you, because oftentimes we don't know what we like until we get involved, right?
Right.
I would have never known that I would have enjoyed it as much as I did, and it's like, it was my passion, and it actually like solidified that like I'm in the right place.
That's so amazing. That's really good to hear. How do you balance your rigorous academic research with the emotional demands of clinical training?
Thankfully, I've gotten a lot better at this because I was not very good at it when I first started out. Referring to my placement at St. Mike's, I think I was seeing like 3 patients a week, and it just felt exhausting. I think there's just the pressure of it being your first placement and like wanting to do so well and wanting to help people so bad, but feeling like you have such limited knowledge that it takes a lot of like mental energy out of you. And it's a bit of a learning curve. And so back then I really struggled after a day of clinical work of like my, measly 1 to 2 hours. I could barely do anything. My mind was just shot. And then that's really what's changed over the last couple of years, is being able to take on more clinical work and having the space for other things on the side. And one of the ways that I have been able to do that is by creating something that like I've deemed my like red-green list. What I do is I separate my to-do list into tasks that are red or like higher energy, require a little bit more time, and green tasks, which might be like answering an email, making a phone call, these types of things. And I know that on days where I have a very like heavy clinical load and I know I'm going to be shot by the end of the day, I set my expectations low, I turn to my green list and I check off a few things and I take that pressure off of myself.
Awesome. You mentioned earlier about applying to clinical psychology programs numerous times, I think 4 times.
Yes, 4 times.
Can you walk us through that journey in a bit more detail?
Totally. Yeah. And it's funny because I look back now and like not all of those application cycles were created equal by any means. So the first cycle I mentioned, I was like a little bit naive. I thought, yeah, I've got the minimum requirements. This should be fine. Not realizing how competitive it was. I was very geographically limited as well too. Like the thought of moving away from my friends and family scared me. So I applied just within BC, no interviews, no one reached out to me about my applications, just like 3 rejections, like right out of the gate. I actually kept my first ever rejection letter, hoping that one day I could look back at it and be like, look how far I've come. And then the next year I applied a little bit more widely and then a little bit more widely, but it really wasn't until the 4th cycle that I felt like I knew a bit of what I was doing. And part of that was because I stumbled across some really good guides online. I also found myself on Reddit, which can be hit and miss in terms of the information you get, but it can be really helpful to hear from other students in terms of what's worked well for them, what kind of stats they had. And that's really where I saw the most progress, because I didn't get an email back from my first 3 cycles. And then my 4th cycle, I think I got like 11 interviews.
Wow.
Yeah. So there was a big change between year 3 and 4. I also kept myself very busy and like very productive. So like I was also building my CV at the same time. Yeah.
For sure.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah.
I'm curious what you did in those years and also what kept you motivated to keep going year after year.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if there's a great answer than that, other than that, like I felt like I was just like too far into it that I had to keep going. My first year, I think it was when I was finishing up my honors thesis, I had a handful of presentations, no publications. And then by the time I got in, I had my honors thesis published. So I had a first author publication. I think I had about 25 conference presentations at that point. I really pushed on the conference presentations. I had some of that clinical experience that I mentioned at the treatment center doing the sex, love, and relationships group, which I think was helpful. And I had, I think, 5 years of research experience at that point across 5 or 6 different roles, working in hospitals, different universities. So I actually do think I had quite a strong application by that last cycle. And then the other thing I did is I got a graduate certificate from the University of Alberta in sexual health.
Yeah.
That was really just to confirm whether that was the route that I wanted to take in grad school. And it was also a little bit helpful because it bumped my GPA a little bit for grad school because it counted as my studies towards my GPA for some schools. So I had a slightly higher GPA when I was done that as well too.
It's amazing.
Yeah, a lot of people in this process are getting discouraged.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for students who are currently applying or have gotten feedback that they haven't been accepted?
Oh my goodness. It's not you. It's probably not you. These systems are like crazy competitive. They also make the assumption that you know what you're doing and you know how to apply and that you've taken the right steps, which somebody like me did not my first cycle. I would say seek mentorship. Absolutely, because that was really what helped. And even if it's not like a single person as a mentor, even if it's like digging through those Reddit threads on the clinical psychology subreddit and finding out what people have done, I think it can be helpful.
How many grad schools did you end up applying to in your last cycle?
Oh my God, like 20.
Oh, wow.
Like a lot. Oh yeah, because I mentioned it was a really isolating experience applying over and over again, not having anyone else I knew applying, and no one in my life knew anything about what this process entailed. They don't understand that it's like a 2% acceptance rate in these programs and all of the hoops you have to jump through. So it got to the point where people would ask me like, oh, are you in grad school yet? And it's no. And I just got a little quieter about it every single year. And I told myself like, maybe this will be my last cycle. So I'm going to go as hard as I can. I applied widely across Canada and widely across the States. I'm grateful now, given the current state of affairs, that I've ended up in Canada. But I actually only got one offer in Canada. So I went where I got my offer.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, we have a little bit of a slideshow for you about clinical psychology graduate school programs.
Sure.
So I'll just give you the iPad, but it's a red flag, green flag. So just give your explanation as to why you think it's a red flag or why you think it's a green flag. There you go.
Okay. No one in the program responds to your emails, red flag. That being said, there's a caveat there. When you send emails, you want to make sure that you've done your due diligence and you've asked a question that can't be easily found on the website. Because then it shows that you haven't done your homework, essentially, if you're asking something that's like painfully obvious. But yeah, if nobody in the program is responding to your emails, I would say that's a red flag.
Okay.
You feel like you have to sacrifice your values to get in, also a red flag. And this is difficult because as somebody who had one offer on the table, you have to remember that not everybody has 100 grad schools to choose from, right? And so you have to think about what values you might be willing to be flexible on and other times what you have hard boundaries with. But I would say as a general rule of thumb, like you shouldn't have to sacrifice your values to get in.
Yeah.
Okay, you've never spoken to a current student or alumni. Red flag in theory. I didn't know I was supposed to do this though when I started. And fortunately, when I got my offer, my supervisor actually connected me with somebody in the program and I was able to speak to them, but I had no idea I was supposed to do that. But it's absolutely great if you can. Take a look at lab websites, cold email a grad student, just say, I'm interested. Do you have any insights? Ask some specific questions. And in my experience, everyone I've reached out to has been lovely and helpful. Yeah. Okay. The program doesn't offer funding or research assistantships. Also a red flag in my opinion, but I also understand that there are programs that are just better for people for other reasons. So you might be geographically limited and you might only have one school that you can apply to, and maybe they don't offer that. And I think I would just urge them to think very carefully about whether they can take on the debt and whether that's doable for them. Ideally, though, you want some sort of support in grad school, absolutely. The program offers consistent supervision and mentorship, green flag, big green flag. I am so lucky in my program that not just my supervisor, but our grad program director, our chair, our DCT are just the most incredible people. I could email them at any time of the day with any question, and they're thoughtful and timely and so supportive. And I attribute a lot of what I've been able to do to the mentorship of the people in my programs. Huge green flag. The program offers hands-on experience or practicum placements, huge green flag. I think that's pretty standard and pretty common, but again, what you'll see some variability in terms of what that looks like and when people do their practicum placements. I know at TMU we start earlier, and I know our hospital placement is like very valuable. So if you want to be very competitive for external placements and internship eventually, definitely look at the type of clinical training that they offer. Are they offering it, like I said, in a hospital versus a university clinic? Do they find you placements in the community? Do you have to find your own placements? Yeah, in the GTA, we're very lucky. We have like a streamlined system where we basically do like a watered down version of the internship match. So we're really lucky in that way, but I know it's not the same everywhere. TA positions are unpaid, red flag. I know at TMU, the way that the TA-ships work is that it's part of your funding package if you don't have any additional funding. So you are paid, but it's an expectation of the program to be funded. But then you can TA on top of that, even if you have external funding.
Right.
So I was obligated my first year, and then I chose to basically every other year.
And are you paid the same regardless of the course you're TAing? Is it pretty much a set figure?
Yes.
Okay.
And I can't remember exactly what the rates are. I think they are published online though, but I know it's basically 2 rates depending on whether you're MA level or PhD level.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you know like a ballpark? I'm just curious, like how much it's changed?
About $50 an hour. The program has a reputation for intense competition and little collaboration. Huge red flag. The tough thing is like this won't always be obvious from the research that you're doing when you're looking at program websites. So this is a really good opportunity to reach out to some current students, is what I would say. My lab is highly collaborative, and I would not have it any other way. I think in this field, we're conditioned to be a little bit competitive just because of how hard it is to get in. But if you can make good friends and keep good collaborations with your colleagues in grad school, you're going to have a much better time.
Right.
For sure.
How many people were in your cohort?
My cohort is 8.
Okay.
Yeah, which I think is pretty standard. I think 6, I think, is probably the lowest that I've seen, and probably 12 is about the highest I've seen. So we're in the middle at about 8. So we're a very tight-knit group. We started just as COVID restrictions were opening up, so our whole first year was online, and it was really great after a year to be able to have classes together in person.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Just curious, for someone, a psych student who is looking for mentorship,
Yeah.
do you have any specific advice on how to find a mentor that would be beneficial for them?
Totally.
Yeah.
I stumbled across it through the Canadian Psychological Association. I got involved with them actually for the first time, I think in 2014. I volunteered to give people their badges at registration. And I think that's where I learned that they had a mentorship program, and I signed up as a mentee. So that was helpful. So they're great, obviously, if you're within Canada. And then beyond that, there's some really good organizations that I've also mentored for. One is Psych and Out is the name of it. And then there's another one, Next Gen Psych Scholars as well. And they're specifically for underrepresented populations in psych. So something like first gen students, LGBTQ students, et cetera. So those are the 3 that come to mind that I have had good experience with. But honestly, if you do a quick Google search for Clinical Psych Mentorship Program Canada, probably lots will come up. Yeah.
What drives your passion for mentorship?
Yeah, just being totally clueless when I applied the first time, if I'm being honest. I mentioned that I made a lot of mistakes that were preventable, and now I feel obligated and compelled to make sure that I at least share information that's helpful for students that are applying so that they don't make some of these same mistakes, because doing applications is time consuming and expensive, and I don't think the GRE is required anymore, but when I applied, the GRE was required, and that was so expensive, and I don't want people to make the same mistakes that I did. So mentorship is really what drives me and really fuels me and gives me purpose in this field, is what I would say.
There must be tons of students that reach out to you for you to be a mentor, but you only have limited resource.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that? And what do you look for someone who you would be willing to invest your time and energy to help?
Yeah, that's a good question. And people do reach out. It's mainly people that I'm connected to already in some sense, via my lab or positions at CAMH or whatever it might be. I've never said no to anybody. I typically ask that they come with kind of some idea of what they want to do and where they want to go, and we can talk about how we want to refine that. But if somebody really needed dedicated mentorship and reviewing their applications and everything like that, and I didn't know them already, I'd probably refer them to one of the organizations that I mentioned. Still always happy to help, but it's contingent upon the time of year and how much capacity I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Can you share a story about a mentee that you had that really inspired you as much as you helped them?
Yeah, for sure. I guess at one point she was my mentee, but now she's a colleague and a good friend, Danielle. I met her in 2016 when I was the lab manager at my university or my undergrad institution. She was an RA, I was the lab manager. I was just finishing my honors thesis. She was always so supportive and just such a loyal person that I had a natural affinity to want to help her as much as I could with her honors thesis. And then eventually with her own grad school apps, she went into a counseling site program. She's now starting her PhD in September. And she's expressed to me that the mentorship I've provided has been really helpful, but she is also one of the most resilient, dedicated, hardworking people I've ever met. She's absolutely the most loyal person, and now I find every opportunity that I can to collaborate with her in every single way, and a really, really good friendship based off of that. And she got into grad school. I probably cried more than her. I watched her present her first conference presentation. I have so much pride in the mentees that I work with because I see how hard they work and how great of a contribution they're going to make to our field.
Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into the assessment tool you've been working on with your dissertation. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah. So I mentioned sex addiction is not clinically recognized. We call it compulsive sexual behavior. It's defined as an impulse control disorder in the ICD-11. Lots of debate, though, about whether it should be considered an impulse control disorder. A lot of people would argue that it should be considered a behavioral addiction. Some people would argue that it's actually falls on the obsessive compulsive spectrum. So with that in mind, with all of these kind of different schools of thought, I wonder if there's a way to assess for the mechanism underlying compulsive sexual behavior. So instead of just looking at the specific symptoms and the behavior itself, like what is driving this behavior? So that's the focus of my dissertation, is developing like a multi-dimensional assessment tool for compulsive sexual behavior, where I'm measuring some of these correlates associated with addiction, and I'm looking at impulsivity, but I'm also looking at compulsivity and hedonism and these different types of things. So the goal would be with that tool is to not necessarily replace anything that we have, but as a supplement, so we can understand as clinicians, like what are the areas of difficulty underlying this behavior? Where is this coming from? Is there something we can target? Yeah.
What are like some of the most common misconceptions that people may have about like compulsive sexual behaviors?
Yeah, I really think part of it is just shaped off of what the media portrayed, what I already talked about, how it's very sensationalized. I think that it's very typical for people to think that if somebody is paying for OnlyFans in a relationship, immediately they've got a sex addiction or whatever it might be. And maybe they do, and maybe they don't. We'd really have to assess that. But I think it really comes down to, is this behavior working for you? If it's not working for you and it's causing him distress and impairment, that's where we need to look at it. But we also need to be really careful to not like over pathologize behaviors that are normal or adaptive for some people, right?
I'm just curious how you balance ethical, cultural, and personal perspectives in working in areas complex and stigmatized as CSB.
100%, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned stigma, because I just submitted a paper on stigma associated with compulsive sexual behavior. I think it's multifaceted because sexual behavior just in general faces a lot of stigma, right? And then you factor in this piece of it being like abnormal or problematic sexual behavior, it's even more stigmatized. And so I think going in with that lens is really important to understand that like when somebody comes to me, it is typically very difficult. They typically haven't discussed this with anybody because of the stigma. Even amongst healthcare providers, there's a big misunderstanding. And then again, being mindful to not over-pathologize the behavior, figuring out, is this working for you? Is it not working for you? And then also from a cultural perspective, just like with other conditions, culturally bound factors, right? Like, you know, healthy sexual behavior can vary from culture to culture. So really understanding, what is this within the context of your life? Is this working for you or not?
So like, for example, there's a lot of shows like Euphoria, Adolescence, that depict like sexual behaviors in a very specific manner. I guess what's your take on how they do so through a psychological lens?
Yeah, and I've watched both and I enjoy both. I'm thinking about Euphoria in particular. I think that there's also an argument to be made that it really like sensationalizes particular types of sex and trauma and these different types of things without really labeling it as that. And so a typical viewer of the show might not know that, oh, this isn't super adaptive or super healthy. So I think that can potentially be problematic, but I also think it depicts how people use sex as a coping mechanism, for example. Again, there's not always that explicit labeling. That would be even a little bit more helpful so people could understand what's happening there. And then Adolescence, that kind of like delves into the whole like toxic masculinity thing and like how our beliefs about sexuality and sexual expectations develop at a young age, right? And what drives that.
Yeah.
I think they're really important, especially Adolescence. I think is a very important show in some sense. Yeah.
So if somebody is maybe concerned that they may have a compulsive sexual behavior, what should they be doing? What steps should they take?
It's a great question. Yeah. And again, it's contingent upon like how comfortable do they feel with their healthcare providers? Right. Because typically the number one thing we recommend is check in with your GP, but then also that's making the assumption that they even have a GP, which not everybody does. So I would say seek help from somebody that you feel comfortable with. There are also services that are more dedicated towards sexuality. I work for a practice that does sex therapy, and so we see a lot of that there. That would be my recommendation, is to try and seek services that are a little bit more specialized and from somebody that has experience in the area, because I would love to say that you could seek help from anybody and it would be treated equally, but there's just not a lot of knowledge around this, and there is such a big role of stigma.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest gaps that you see between academic knowledge and then the public's knowledge of like sexual health?
Yeah. Again, I think this tendency in the media to over-pathologize sexual behavior. I am in a place of privilege where I've seen a wide range of sexual interests. Not much phases me, but the common denominator is people always come to me and they say, I have this thing, I think I'm the only one, it's so weird, it's so strange, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not. And again, it comes down to, is this working for you or is this not working for you? Is this a problem for you within your life? And a lot of times the answer is, well, I don't think so, but I'm told that it should be a problem, whether that's through the media, friends, family, etc.
Now, has studying addiction changed the way you view spending, saving, and impulsivity in your own life?
Yeah, I guess to some extent you could say that. I'm a pretty risk averse person. I'm not a gambler or anything like that. But definitely when I think about impulsivity and shopping, just as an example, I think we're so conditioned to see something on TikTok and, oh my goodness, that girl looks so good in that top. I need that top, right? And immediately running to the website, pulling it up, adding it to cart, and thinking about how impulsive that is and often how mindless that is. And so I absolutely try to be more intentional now and delay these little impulses that I have to maybe put something in cart or whatever it might be.
What advice would you give to future clinicians hoping to build a meaningful and financially sustainable career?
Yeah, I guess my answer would be in the question would be to find something that feels meaningful for you and figure out a way to make it work, essentially. I think that's how you build a sustainable career, is by doing something that you feel is very fulfilling and very purposeful. And then also recognizing your worth too. Right. I think oftentimes, especially as students, we're very used to taking any opportunity and just running with whatever. But there's going to come a point where you realize, you know what, I actually have expertise and it's okay for me to be able to charge this much for my services or consultation or whatever it might be, and finding a happy medium between what's purposeful and what can I actually use to sustain myself long term.
Right.
Looking ahead, what are you most excited about in your career and your pathway?
I'm excited to know where I'm going to be in 5 years because I don't know exactly. I chose clinical psychology because of how much variability there is in terms of what the career paths look like. I want to teach. I want to do research forever. I'd love to stay involved in clinical work, but I don't know what that's going to look like. So I'm just excited to know, where do I land in 5 years? And hopefully it's a nice, healthy mix of everything, because I am not a 9 to 5, do one thing for the rest of my life kind of girl.
Yeah.
Speaking on that, do you have any professional or personal goals you're currently working towards?
That's a good question. I would say a professional goal that I'm working towards is increasing my teaching dossier. Like I mentioned, I taught a course and I'm hopefully going to teach another course. I think that oftentimes in this field, we don't get enough education around how to teach and how to communicate these things. And so for me, I would say that's my goal, is to learn how to teach and to learn how to communicate about different topics with different audiences.
Right.
Is there a specific quote or mantra that you have that keeps you going when you're overwhelmed or stressed?
Yeah, one day at a time. Take things one day at a time, 1 minute at a time, 1 second at a time. That's what got me through my most difficult time in grad school, actually. When I first started the clinical work, I felt so overwhelmed and it felt like, I don't know if this is sustainable forever. But instead of making any decisions about what that means or whether I should leave the program or change career paths, one day at a time, see how it goes. And sure enough, it just gets progressively easier.
And just finally, what's next for you, in the immediate horizon, and where can people learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I've got a lot of conferences this summer that I'm excited about. I'll actually be at CPA, so I'm going to St. John's for CPA, I guess in a couple of weeks now, which is exciting. I've never been out that way. I'll also be going to France for a conference as well in July, so that's very exciting. And then I'll just be applying for internship over the next year, and a year from now, hopefully I'll match and I'll know whether I'm staying, whether I'm moving, and I have no doubt that's going to probably shape the rest of the trajectory of my career, because I might find something that I've never done before that I love.
Yeah. It's amazing. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your insights and your journey. It was really inspiring to hear, and how resilient you were, applying 4 times. It's really, I think our listeners will take a lot away from this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.